Greetings, beloved. Thank you for tuning in today. It is the dream of many people to purchase homes. While many people choose to purchase a home that is already built, others may choose to build from the ground up. Either way, the builder is required to use a blueprint. A blueprint is defined as a design or plan put on paper for the purpose of constructing a building successfully. The same way construction workers follow the blueprint in order to successfully build a house, likewise, Christians who want to build a solid family must be willing to follow God's blueprint to do so. Stay tuned as we discuss the design that God has given us to follow, God's blueprint for family.
We want to say greetings to everyone and God bless you and thank you for joining us today for God's Blueprint for Family. My name is Brother Hawk Bolden, and of course, sitting here with me is my lovely wife, Sister Antoinette Bolden, and we're always glad, as always, to bring you the word of the Lord concerning what God's blueprint is for family.
Amen, and greetings to everyone. We had a really interesting topic last week. I don't know if the Lord is going to lead us to continue to go in that direction. But, you know, we dealt with dealing with neglect or feeling neglected in the marriage. And, you know, that's something that I would imagine at any point, depending on what's going on in your life. For some people, it might be a sick parent that might take a lot of their attention that may cause that spouse to be neglected. For some people, it might be overtime at work. For some, it may be kind of rendering support to the children. It can be different things that might cause one spouse to, you know, feel that way, and a number of other reasons, but those are just a few of them. But I just think it's important for us as married couples that we think enough of our marriage that when we are able to identify things that will cause a wedge between that husband and wife, anything at all that will cause any type of division, that when we recognize that we're able to come together to resolve it and rearrange priorities, rearrange schedules, assure that spouse that, you know, hey, this marriage is still number one, and find a way to work in everything else that needs to be worked in so that the marriage is not being neglected. And so I really enjoyed, you know, us just kind of discussing that, and we were answering a question that was sent in to us by another sister. So, of course, with that being said, we want to encourage, you know, those of you who view these broadcasts on television, or, you know, those of you who are continuing to tune in from week to week, if you have a question that you want to submit that maybe you don't want to share by calling in live, but although you may be listening live, if you want to ask a question that you want us to read aloud and address live, and it can be anonymous, you're welcome to do that. You know, you can email us through the website or just give us a call, and of course that information is given at the end of the broadcast. So you're welcome to do that as well, and we'd be happy to address those things. And, you know, for some of you, it may just be a praise report. Mm-hmm. You know, you may have a praise report to share with others who can benefit from maybe a hurdle or obstacle that you've overcome in your marriage.
Mm-hmm. Amen. And so that's a very touchy subject when you're talking about neglect. That's a pretty bad feeling to have when you feel like you're being neglected, because the person that feels like they're being neglected, in their minds, their spouse is putting something or someone else before them. Mm-hmm. You know, and of course, you gave us a list of things that people could feel neglected for. And so then, of course, the question is how to tackle that, you know, how to deal with that. You know, on one hand, you want to address it. Then on the other hand, because those kind of conversations can oftentimes take a turn for the worse, because the person who feels neglected, they could come across as being overbearing, or they could come across as being selfish, or they could come across as being demanding. Mm-hmm. When in reality, you know, what's going on is they're hurt, you know, and maybe they're expressing it, you know, in a manner that because of all of that hurt buildup, I guess you could say. And so the person who is being talked to concerning doing the neglecting, I guess, the one that's doing the neglecting, they can tend to shut down, because in those kind of situations, you want to be careful that you're not pointing the finger, and you have to approach those things using the wisdom of God, While you want to bring up the concern, you want to make sure that you're not pointing the finger, that you're not basically putting it on the shoulder of that person, basically telling them, okay, because of you, the marriage is just going to putt, And so there's a way to handle things.
Right.
And, oftentimes, we want to make sure that when there is something wrong in the marriage, whether it's neglect or whatever it may be, that you include yourself in it in some kind of way.
Right.
In other words, I think that we can do this better. Now, sometimes, you can't avoid the whole, this is what needs to happen type of thing. And of course, honesty is what's needed. And but you want to make sure that the person that you're talking to, that you feel is neglecting you, doesn't feel like they are being just put under the microscope, or that they are being condemned, I guess you could say. You want to make sure that you do it in a wise manner.
Right. And I was sitting here thinking the same thing as you spoke of it, that we have to maintain this mindset that we're on the same team. You don't want your spouse to feel like you're attacking them whenever you're addressing something, but in essence, the two of you coming together to attack the problem. And that's one of the things we talk about in rules of engagement. Don't attack each other, but attack that issue, whatever it is. Like I said, if you just use overtime, for an example, if this spouse may have mandatory overtime, or it may just be trying to get some extra money for something special, then find a way to rearrange the schedule so that the overtime is not just totally getting in the way, or find a way to come together and say, hey, well, let's only do this temporarily for this amount of time, or let's come to an agreement that if it's not mandatory overtime and we choose to take this route in terms of getting extra money, let's say that, in a 3-month period, it won't be more than this amount of time. Come to an agreement with things like that so that it doesn't become an issue. Every time it comes up, you can have an understanding about it. But the idea is that you have to know and operate like you're on the same team, not like you're attacking each other, but that you're coming together to work out whatever the issue might be.
Yeah, and I think that that's so important, that people do not feel attacked when issues are being brought up, especially in neglect. Now, let me just say this. When you're talking about something like neglect, that's that could be a very hurtful experience for the person that's going through it. And the thing about neglect is the other person who's doing the neglecting, they may not be aware that they're doing it. And so oftentimes you got both, you got polarization of both sides. One side is very, very hurt and affected by it. And then you have the other side of it that's very unaware maybe. And so now you have these two sides come together, trying to discuss it, and it can be a nightmare if you're not careful. And so you have to keep in mind, when you're talking about something like neglect, that you don't let that build up. I mean, when you spot it and you're sure that you're feeling that way, you bring it up. Don't try to say, well, I'm going to be the bigger person, I'm just going to go through. There's nothing wrong with sharing how you feel, with your spouse. Right. And it, of course, also is important that the spouse who this is being shared with, that they don't turn down, or they don't, just throw away what the spouse is saying, that feel like they're being neglected. Because even that can be a form and come across as neglect, You know, I'm telling you about how I'm feeling concerning being neglected in this marriage or relationship or whatever. And now you're turning that down and throwing that out the window as if, and so that can be a very hurtful feeling. And oftentimes that one little thing of feeling neglected, people start looking for other things that's going to give them time, And I say this, and I stick by this: don't start what you can't finish. And it's one thing if somebody get into a marriage and, it's always been that way. It's another thing, and oftentimes this is what takes place, is people get into a marriage and they going full speed ahead in it because it's new, it's exciting, and then before you know it, then routine kick in and
get past cloud nine.
Exactly. And so then that one who's expecting it to always be the way that it was starts feeling neglected. And now let me make this clear. There will be times when people, when situations come up, and you have to give room, and you have to make room for that kind of thing. But we're talking about neglect on a constant basis. We're not talking about, okay, you did this last week, but you're doing something different this week. We're talking about just that constant feeling. And so it's important that when that spouse who's feeling neglected is actually feeling that way, that they evaluate where those feelings are coming from, that they are realistic concerning those feelings, and things like that. They have to be realistic with it and things. And so, that's also important. And I find, too, as well, that oftentimes, especially if a spouse is a stay-at-home spouse or whatever the case is, maybe a stay-at-home wife, they can oftentimes feel more neglected than somebody who's out working right alongside their husband or their wife, or who's working a 9-to-5 as well, because you have all of this empty time, maybe I should say, or maybe all of this time, maybe it's just with the kids or something like that. And, being in the home, you're used to being with your spouse in the home, And so sometimes it's a good idea to find things to do if you find that your reason for feeling neglected isn't reasonable, if that makes any sense.
All right. Now, you're talking about it from the standpoint of the person who's feeling neglected, and I just want to go back real briefly to the example we used about overtime, just because it's real easy to use that. You mentioned last week something that I wanted to just kind of reiterate, that it's important that when you identify whatever that thing is that may be causing you to feel neglected, that you don't downplay the importance of it. And this is just a brief scenario of overtime. Of course, if the man is working overtime, then it's because he's feeling like he needs more money to provide something a little extra for the family. So then the wife can't say, oh, I hate your job, your overtime is taking all of my time, I don't want you to do that anymore, or whatever, because then that might translate into you're not allowing me to take care of my family the way I want to, and so you don't want to do that kind of thing, but make sure that you acknowledge the importance of what the person is doing, and make sure you get the message across that, hey, I understand this is important, I understand why it has to be done, but let's figure out a way to keep it from coming between us, kind of thing.
But on the other side of it as well, there are some things that people take up that not because they're trying to save extra money, or because, because there is a such thing as workaholics, folks that just like to work, don't necessarily need the extra money. And a cousin of mine was talking about her husband making good money, with the job that he has, but if she had it, she prefer his time over the amount of money that he makes. And oftentimes, it's about prioritizing, and I believe that in those circumstances you can meet in the middle somewhere, And a lot of times, even moving past the job, sometimes people take up hobbies and things like that. So outside of the job, let's say it like that, outside of the job, where you may not be able to go to work with your spouse or whatever the case may be, but, you know, if I take up a hobby, then if we're married, I think that it's important that we do things together. You know what I mean? I'm talking about outside of work. And to me, that will help.
All right.
Oftentimes, when people get married, they come together long enough to get married, and then they begin to drift apart. In other words, they start establishing their own lives, you know, even in marriage and things. And so oftentimes, if people aren't moving at a steady pace, you know, in the same direction, then one or the other will start feeling neglected. And so it's important. I mean, listen, you have to actually work on being married. And I think the reason why,
right.
you know, people aren't making it today is because they're not working on it, you know. I mean, it takes work. It's not just, and so you have to, when you run into these things, you have to find ways to resolve them, because if you don't, they're just going to keep coming up over and over again, you know, especially when you're talking about neglect, you know. And so, because trust me, you know, and I think what happens in a lot of marriages is people, they have issues. One issue come up, they don't resolve it. They may talk about it, but it never gets resolved. And then another issue come up that doesn't get resolved, and then another issue. And so I think it's important that when these issues come up, as they come up, they get resolved, so that you can have energy and be, you know, refreshed for the new problem that's going to come up. Because I mean, I'm telling you, that's what marriage is. You're just constantly resolving issues. You got two grown folks living together, so you know, everybody's not going to just play well all the time. You know, you have to find a way to get along, and you have to find a way to, you know, to resolve these things. And I think what happens a lot of times, especially when you're talking about neglect, is when somebody bring up neglect, especially if a spouse says, I feel like I'm being neglected, they are putting themselves in a position of vulnerability. And oftentimes people don't want to do that. You know, they want to portray this strong person, and I can just, you know, just deal with whatever. But in reality, they're hurting on the inside because they're feeling neglected. And oftentimes, especially men, don't want to confess that to their spouse. I'm feeling neglected, because what that means is, you know, I'm still head over heels for you, and I still love and enjoy your time. And basically, when you tell your spouse that you're feeling neglected, you're putting yourself at their mercy. Because it's something that they, you know, now you're putting the ball in their court, which means depending on how they dribble it, it depends on the outcome, you see. And so oftentimes people don't even want to tackle it, which is why people go so long without saying anything. They get this empty feeling like their needs aren't being fulfilled, you know, however that neglect may come. And they don't say anything, you know, and they deal with it. They deal with it because they don't want to come across as being complaining and stuff like that. But the day will come where it will all add up, you know, and it's just all, you get nerve wrecked, and, you know, it's an open door for the enemy to come in and cause you to fulfill that neglect in other ways, you know, to, you know, maybe open the door for other people to be in your life, or and things like that. And so, you know, other things I should say as well, you know, people find all kind of ways to fill voids in their lives. And so it's important, you know, that you tackle those issues.
Oh, yes, definitely. And of course, you know, I'm sitting here as you're talking, thinking about, you know, one of the things we picked up from a book that we read. And of course, if any of the listeners or viewers have read this book, they'll know where it comes from. But we kind of do a check between the two of us every now and then, and we ask each other about our love tank, and is it filled or not? You know, is your love tank full? And that's something that, as husband and wife, and I'm just sharing this, you know, with all of you who are tuned in, that you can do. Issues are going to come up, and they'll have to be resolved. But whether your spouse says they feel neglected or not, what you can do is establish how you keep up with how your spouse is feeling.
That's right.
Find out what it is that they enjoy you doing for them, that thing that makes them smile the most, that thing that makes them most happy. And from time to time, you just ask your spouse, is your love tank full? In other words, am I still doing those things that make you happy? Are you feeling fulfilled? Are you, kind of like having a gas tank? You have to fill it up, but that tank of gas don't last forever.
That's right.
And so the same concept goes for the love tank, is that you want to keep it filled with those encouraging words and the affection and the love and even, some of the challenging moments, whatever it is that it takes to make that spouse feel fulfilled. You want to keep that love tank full with those things.
That's right.
And
and I'm glad you brought that up about the love tank, and it's just like having a gas tank, of course. And you can't run on gas for 3 weeks. In other words, I can't do something for you 3 weeks ago, and then expect you to still be running off of those fumes.
Right.
No, I need to constantly show you that I love you.
Right.
It's not just enough to say, okay, I married you, I love you, I'm here every night, I pay the bills, that's not enough,
Right.
Because think about it. Most of us who are married, maybe we weren't living together before, so we maybe weren't paying bills before, maybe it was certain things that we weren't doing, but so how we can't go back to those things or go to those things, to I guess keep the love tank full. We have to do what we were doing. What gas were we using before? Okay, well that's what we have to keep doing.
Exactly.
So it's important that we find out, just like you said, what love language, I guess you could say, our spouse speaks. And then speak that love language.
Right.
Speak it.
Right. So if I understand what you were saying correctly a minute ago, you're saying that, if before you got married, you were going on dates frequently or buying greeting cards or flowers or gifts, or just always, showering each other with love, then once you get married, you can't say, oh, well, I'm not going to do all those things, but we're living in the house together and we're raising children together and we're paying bills, so that's just it. Just know that I love you from that. Okay, so and that's what you were saying, that that can't be the measurement, because all of that wasn't going on before the marriage anyway. There were some other things factoring in. And so we want to keep that in mind, that we just continue to speak that same love language that got us to the altar.
Amen. So we just think that that's very, very important, that especially when you're talking about neglect, because if somebody's feeling neglected, 9 times out of 10, it wasn't that way before marriage.
Right.
Other than that, they probably would not have married you, And so it's important. And now, of course, you and I, we've talked about this whole issue of putting the marriage on cruise control, and that oftentimes that's what happens. People get married. And another thing is they get used to one another. They become common with one another. But, it's important that you go out of your way to make sure that your spouse isn't feeling neglected.
Right.
Of course, there's this old saying about cars. If you take care of your car take care of you, You get the oil changed every 3 months like you're supposed to, and do all this other maintenance on them, they'll last longer. And that's what we're talking about, is maintenance, on a marriage.
Exactly.
When a spouse is feeling neglected, it's just like your car feeling neglected. You haven't put any water in me, so I'm gonna run hot, or no gas. You don't get to drive me if you don't, And oftentimes that's what's needed in a marriage is, folks' love tank need to be filled back up, And when the spouse is feeling neglected, they are not getting that scheduled maintenance. They're not getting what they need to continue to move forward and to feel loved. Because when a spouse feels neglected, they don't feel loved.
Right.
And then the enemy gets to playing on their minds about whether or not, they've married the right person, or whether or not they're really loved, and all of these things, And so love is an action word, and it has to be shown, And when a spouse is feeling neglected, no matter how much you love them, they may not feel it. Apparently they don't, if they're feeling neglected, And so we have to work on a marriage. And I'm telling you, it is very important that people work on their marriage. Work on, making sure that their spouse feel the exact same way they felt when they were standing at that altar. And trust me, it takes work. It's not just everything, it's just lovely and peaches and cream all the time,
Right. Love does not make it all just fall into place all the time.
Exactly.
Even with love being present, with that unconditional love being present, you still have to work.
That's right.
To keep everything in order. And we can't forget the fact that we have an enemy to contend with. As we always say, our marriage is supposed to represent Christ and his church. And so the enemy is going to come against that. Don't think that, love is going to handle it all. We're in love. We're soulmates. The Lord brought us together, and therefore we're on easy street. Not so. Still have to work extra hard. And I'm sure people may see us sometimes and think we just have the perfect marriage because they see us, minister together or, and things like that, or may see us being affectionate, and things like that. But, it really does take work. It really, really does take work. And, you and I, we've had some hard down discussions about different issues that we've had in the past. And, it's important that people know what you see out on the front is not necessary, is a result of us taking business behind the scenes, taking care of business behind the scenes. It's not, every couple that's been married for 50 years or whatever, however long they've been married, if they're truly happy, it's because they chose to work on their happiness. Right.
And oftentimes people don't want to do that. They just think Cloud 9 carried them into the marriage, and so they think it's just going to be that way for the rest of their lives. And then when Cloud 9 runs out, what else is there? And so you have to choose not to neglect, your spouse. You have to choose to love them. And that is a decision. That is a decision. We're not going to, because I want you to think about it in this manner. It's not just your spouse. If you have a spouse that's feeling neglected, it's not just them that you're neglecting. You're neglecting your marriage. Now, that's what's really going on. You're neglecting your marriage. And so it's important that people pay attention. Pay attention. And like you said, ask your spouse how they're feeling. Don't wait until they done got frustrated and not, because every spouse isn't just going to speak up. Some of them will, but some of them, just for the sake of not arguing, will just let things ride and just let things go until they just ready to blow up and hurt somebody, So we just have to be careful that we speak to one another and ask, is everything okay, and things like that. That just keeps it down. And then also it tells your spouse that you care about them, that I care about how you feel.
All right. Amen. This is pretty sad, but I'm going to share this. So when you said it's important to ask your spouse, how they're feeling, I remember when we first got married,